Good morning, everyone. Welcome to session 5C on long-term care modeling. I hope you've been having a good conference so far. Yeah? Okay. Great, Tom. Well, in this session, we want to talk to you about long-term care modeling and how does that find its way onto the agenda for Living to 100. I think you'll all agree, and we heard this morning from Dr. James that there are a lot of concerns around not just the cost of retirement, but also the costs concerned with healthcare, and that the aging society will actually incur or creates a huge demand for long-term care. Unfortunately, as an industry, we haven't done the greatest job of providing those kinds of products. And that's not, that has a lot of different reasons, but one of them is that it's actually quite a complicated and challenging product to get right, to price. So that's why we had the idea of putting long-term care modeling on the agenda. I'd like you to join us in reviewing some of the challenges that long-term care modeling gives us, as well as looking at a work case study for practical use. I'd like to just very briefly introduce the two presenters today. Ben Miclette is a Canadian actuary. He runs his own consulting firm, but before that he spent, let's say, a couple of decades in the reinsurance industry and working at several different reinsurers, mainly on living benefits. So he's our resident expert on long-term care, amongst other living benefits products. Jonathan Crawford is a South African actuary, so we've got an international panel today. And he recently joined Energy Consulting in Toronto. And together, the three of us have actually worked on a fairly substantial long-term care project recently, which is why I had the idea of recruiting them to speak to us today. So I'll hand it over to Ben to take us through a review of this interesting topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. I'm assuming everybody in the back can hear me. I'm getting nods, so that's a good thing. So the way we split up the session this morning, my job is sort of to introduce what's the situation with the industry at the moment when it comes to products that combine morbidity and mortality together. So I'll be talking about the products themselves and some of the challenges. And I'll pass it over to Jonathan, who will be focusing on how to apply these issues or solve these issues or address these issues through modeling in R. So the purpose of the session, I really want to emphasize the importance of cross-expertise collaboration. As Kai mentioned, the three of us have worked on a project recently, and we really benefit from having mortality and morbidity expertise in the same room as we tackle some of these new and challenging products that I'll be talking about. I also want to make a case for more research on impaired mortality. It's something that is near and dear to my heart. One of my volunteer roles for the SOA is I sit on the steering committee for mortality and longevity research. And it's a topic that comes back from time to time. So I'm secretly hoping that some of you are researchers and are looking for something juicy to sink your teeth in. And hopefully I can make a good case for you to consider a project like this. And then, like I said, I'll pass it over to Jonathan after that for a real-life insurance product example. So really what we're doing is we're merging living longer with living benefits. And that cross-expertise collaboration, although we often hear of insurance companies being life and health companies, I have found over 20 plus years as a reinsurance actuary as well as an independent consultant, it doesn't really happen. A lot of times separate divisions, sometimes separate companies altogether deal with mortality risk versus morbidity risk. And that cohesion should happen more and more. Globally, we're seeing more and more products that make use of that collaboration because the benefits are interlinked. So we're listing here some of the examples. Disability income insurance riders on life insurance, not a new product in the US. Often it's still a separate product, separate benefits. But around the globe, we're starting to see more and more of these products where the life benefit is eaten away by disability benefit over time. So the two benefits are interlinked. And that's when that interaction between those two actuaries will be crucial. Impaired annuities, we see them in different markets, basically underwritten annuities where people who are in impaired health get a higher benefit after some underwriting is done. Enhanced annuities, where you get a regular annuity where you, if you meet certain criteria, claim criteria, you can get a higher benefit paid to you. And then we see all the combination products, and if you work in the US markets, you will come across those, combining life and long-term care or annuities with long-term care, accelerated death benefit for terminal, chronic, or critical illness products, viatical settlements. All these products you're starting to see emerge in various markets. We're starting to see this in the US as well over the last few years, where that single benefit might be paid for different causes. And that really emphasizes the need for more research to be able to more precisely price or value these products. So that collaboration, I believe, is very important. And really, when we get down to it, what we need to study is impaired mortality. And at the moment, there's very little information available. There's health insurance data, mortality insurance data that we can use, where everybody is underwritten, so healthy at the time of issue. And if you look at that data, a lot of the studies will look at impaired health or people who are in substandard health, but it's usually a very small component, and it's not very homogeneous. It includes people who didn't qualify for preferred and the standard classes. And at the same time, you have people who have perhaps been put into the substandard class because they were 3 or 4 tables or 75 to 100% higher mortality than standard, all the way to maybe 300 or 400%. So it's quite a large group. Usually it's too small to analyze in great detail. The other aspect that I'm hopeful is that health gadgets, so the Fitbits, the Apple Watches, which are designed to help incentivize people to stay healthy from the time the policy is issued, I'm hoping we'll gather data, obviously, on the healthy people, but by default we'll also measure information on the people who are not meeting those criteria over time. So I'm hoping that through that we'll get more information on impaired mortality. There's also population studies, which are certainly more wide in terms of who is covered or represented. But a lot of time the data is hard to parse, and it's very hard to actually try to do a study on this. And usually it's not done on a longitudinal basis. So as more and more of these products emerge, products I've listed before, you'll find people with diverse medical background, medical condition. Some of the products, we're seeing this in Asia, where you're covered for pre-existing conditions, not just for health data, which may happen here in the health products, which happens maybe in the US, but for even critical illness condition products, etc. So as these products are emerging, we'll see a pattern change in who collects on these benefits. The behavior and the mortality of these groups will actually be very interesting to study. So I'm hoping some of you will be keen to look at this in more detail. In terms of the data that we have at the moment, there's not a lot of good sources. The SOA publishes the disability study, which looks at terminations from claim, which could be because of recovery or mortality. So we do have that data. Same thing with long-term care. There is a component that looks at the mortality of people who are on claim. There's medical claim data. A lot of times they're group business data, so you can't get that long-term monitoring of individuals. Viatical settlements, pension mortality, life insurance, all of these will look at, will have data in it that looks at impaired mortality. But they're very hard to piece together into something cohesive. So they have different definitions, they're sold differently, the underwriting might be different as well. But as more and more of these products emerge, I think we'll have to look at this in detail and also add other layers of behavioral aspects that will need to be studied. One other key important aspect, when you start to look at products which share a benefit, again, you have to look at these populations differently, those that will use the morbidity benefits versus mortality. It raises the question, where is the mortality improvement going? Is it the healthy people that are just, with every generation, are healthier and healthier? Or is it the people who are in impaired health and because of medication, technology, change in habits, are afforded a longer life? And as you start to separate these populations in your pricing, that assumption is going to become very important to look at. So when looking at what happens in older age and you get sick, really we're looking at covering the needs of individuals, a lot of time medical needs or comfort needs that they have. And the products that exist in the US, medical insurance, disability income insurance for working years, critical illness is still quite limited in scope in the US, but that also is a product. And usually the one that comes to mind when you think of older people getting sick is long-term care. But long-term care, if you're familiar with this, doesn't have a good reputation. I've included a few quotes here, but essentially the sales of long-term care have been going down since at least 2000. In contrast, hybrid products, where you combine two risks, the life with long-term care, for example, those sales have been going up, and some years double-digit. So it raises, obviously, a level of interest by insurance companies to find out more about this and to offer these products, because there seems to be some enthusiasm around it, but also raises question, why is it growing at that speed as well? So looking at that, hybrid is doing better than long-term care. Why is this happening? Long-term care has had a lot of bad publicity in the last few years because of underpricing, so people have seen their premium rates go up quite a bit. Some insurance carriers have decided to exit altogether. And there's also concerns from the investment communities when they look at stocks of companies that have long-term care portfolios, whether they're able to manage the portfolio and value it properly. In contrast, hybrid products are new. I say newish because they've been in existence for quite a while, but their popularity picked up after the tax rules changed and allowed people to use their death benefit and pick at it by taking out money tax-free to pay for long-term care services. The product is new. Not a lot of information is available in terms of the reported experience. And one of the key aspects that's attractive for insurance companies offering this is the total payout is limited. If you're sharing benefits between your mortality benefit between long-term care and death benefit, then there's a cap. That's usually the concern with traditional long-term care, where you don't know how long you're going to pay for the individual if they have unlimited benefit, for example. With this, there's a cap. There's just the maximum you're going to pay. It's also easier to explain to people. You basically tell them you're interested in having life insurance, but should something happen to you in the future, something more catastrophic, and resulting in you getting a chronic illness, you can access that money earlier. And you don't have to wait until you're dead, obviously. And you compare that to long-term care, where you're telling someone you can buy this product, long-term care, and if you become sick, you can use it, but otherwise you basically pay this premium. I'm not going to say for nothing, because there are non-forfeiture options, etc., but you basically may not use the benefit altogether. While your hybrid product, if you keep your product, if it's a whole life and you decide to keep it until the end, then there will be a benefit paid at the end. So when we're looking at those hybrid products, I've listed a few. If you want more information, I included a link at the bottom. The SOA has a great paper on it. So the first one is the accelerated death benefit for chronic illness. So once you meet the threshold of what is defined to be chronic illness, the life policy will start to accelerate the benefit. It could be done because of a chronic illness, terminal illness, which has been in existence for quite a while, as well as critical illness. If you have, let's say you need a heart transplant, for example, they can accelerate your benefits for that reason. We also see products where a life policy will be paid out over a period of time. So your life benefit will be paid out over a 24-month period. It may have extension of benefit as well for long-term care. It can be combined with different things. But essentially all these products have one thing in common, is they look at giving you option should you become severely impaired or your health deteriorates fast. So all these products have that component of morbidity and mortality combined together. And what we'll focus on, and the basis for the model that Jonathan will present, is the accelerated death benefit on chronic illness. Just to give you a bit of information so you can understand how the product works, there's 3 common types of benefit. There's the discounted death benefit approach, where if you meet the threshold and you submit a claim, your death benefit is just taken at a discount from based on an evaluation, either on set mortality tables, or an underwriter will review your case. And then if you have so many years to live, they'll discount the value. Another approach is the lien approach. You can think about it as a loan. Every benefit that is paid early accumulated with interest, and the remaining amount left is paid out to beneficiaries at death. Then the last one is the dollar-for-dollar benefit reduction, where your full benefit amount is advanced to you. It could be in lump sum or it could be over a few years, but your total benefit is paid to you. So there's no discounting, there's no accumulation of interest on the payments made to you. It's just paid overall. So in terms of the 3, the last one is really the one that has, in terms of uncertainty, there's more uncertainty around the payment event. Because really we're looking at how far in advance are we going to pay this benefit? The individuals are still going to die. It's just a matter of whether we start to pay them early or not. The SOA, again, did a good survey on this. And what I wanted to show here is just the view of the respondents, so companies that offer these products, and looking at whether they think the mortality assumption is going to be affected by adding this rider, or whether the policy persistency, the lapses, will be affected, whether there's any optionality or anti-selection that will take place, or whether there's profitability issues that will come from adding it. And in general, if you look at the results, most of the respondents said that they see no impact or minimal impact. Now, obviously you can look at this and say it's too early, but nonetheless, there seems to be some optimism that this benefit is quite easy to add and has little impact on the overall products. If you took a look at the quotes I was giving earlier, currently about 25% of the products sold in the US actually have a rider like this. So what are the key assumptions? So the key ones are obviously your incidence, how many people actually use this benefit for chronic illness, which leads to questions then if you have one single benefit that you need to split up and one of them will be paid early, you need to split your population between those that are in impaired health versus healthy lives. Each of them will have different mortality once you start to split them. You could have assumptions for lapses, whether you think the lapses will be different. You may come very quickly to the conclusion that people who are in impaired health and collecting benefit are not going to lapse their policy. And obviously the other ones, interest rate and waiver of premium, which raises a question you can ask yourself, what assumption do you think will have the most impact? Is it the incidence or is it the mortality? Jonathan will help you answer that question later on. In terms of data sources, for incidence, the key one is obviously determining what trigger are you going to use, because your mortality is going to be linked to it. So again, going back to the same SOA survey, you can see, just take a sip of water. You can see that there's a variety of answers to that question. Some companies are using 2 out of 6 ADLs, which seems to be the most popular answer. So 2 out of 6 activities of daily living, like eating, dressing, bathing, or cognitive impairment. In some cases, they use this definition with severe cognitive impairment. Some of them might request that you have a permanent stay in your nursing home in order to collect for these benefits. So there's a variety of answers, and as you can guess, the mortality associated with each of them will be different. Overall, 14 out of 23 plans surveyed expected the condition to be permanent in order to pay out. So you have that aspect of permanency, which is not always easy to define. Having worked in long-term care for several years, you come across cases which are quite difficult to assess for a doctor to say this is a permanent condition or not. And if you think of younger lives, it's even more difficult than older ages. In terms of the studies that you can use, the SOA does have a study, as I mentioned earlier, and it's based on long-term care products. So 2 out of 6 ADLs and cognitive impairment are the definitions used. It does not require permanency, but it does monitor claim after the onset of claim, so you can see who recovers versus who dies, and that impaired mortality assumption can be derived from it. I also want to give a bit of a shout out to the CIA, the Canadian Institute of Actuaries, because we develop a critical illness basis. And the reason I bring it up is it does have one of the medical condition is loss of independent existence, which is based on 2 out of 6 ADLs and cognitive impairment, which should sound familiar by now. But it does require the condition to be permanent. And again, that having that permanent issue is subjective. Older ages may not be so, but younger ages definitely. And you may think that long-term care has been in existence, so it should be straightforward. It's different when you pay a lump sum or a period over a short period of time versus, we'll pay you as long as you incur expenses. It's a very different story. I can tell you some of the claims we've seen on long-term care and even on critical illness for that condition was someone who had Parkinson's disease and would say, well, I'm on medication. As long as I take medication, I'm well controlled, and I can do these 2 out of 6 ADLs. But insurance company, are you asking me to get off medication for 3 months, 4 months, so I can meet your definition and get the lump sum? It seems to be, it sounds counterintuitive for people to want to do this, but you're offering them money, so their behavior might actually be quite different. And if you think of someone who has Alzheimer's disease, once a person is told by a doctor that they have Alzheimer's disease, it really affects their lives. They start to worry about forgetting. They start to worry about forgetting to turn off the stove or forgetting their keys, locking the doors. And everything sort of is amplified even more. And they do feel more and more like they're losing their independence. And again, if you're looking at a product that has the ability to pay them a lump sum, it can affect their choices as well in terms of determining whether they feel that they need the help or not. Very different, again, when you're looking at paying a lump sum versus expense reimbursement, where you're asking the insured to bring someone to their home to supervise them. Not everybody's comfortable with that. But if we say, we'll give you a lump sum if you meet those definitions, the behavior could be very different. And all this is to say, again, who's going to be claiming at what point. Leads us to the mortality assumption. Logically, you might think, well, if you have a life insurance product and you just add this rider, what is affected? And you saw the answers from the survey. A lot of them said nothing changes, because in totality, the same number of people will die every year. So it doesn't really affect the behavior of the product unless you think there's anti-selection taking place. So if it's the same number of people who die every year, it's just a matter that you're going to isolate some of them and start to pay them earlier. They'll still die when they're supposed to, but they'll die earlier. And that assumption is key in pricing a product like this, because you're really playing with the timing of the benefit, not that you're going to pay or not. It's the matter of when you're going to pay. So it leads us to look at impaired mortality, and by default, then, your healthy mortality, which should be the remaining group out of this. And this is just a simple example. But basically, if you think of the total, the light blue line, or the middle one if you're sitting in the back, as your total or standard mortality for a population, and you isolate people between impaired and healthy, or your active lives, then the higher you think that red line is, the higher number of people who are in impaired health. So at one point, as you move that up, you're putting downward pressure on the mortality of the remaining group. Because if you're saying every year, these are the people that are going to die, that means the other group is going to remain healthy or alive for another year. So by pushing the limits, you essentially create boundaries around the assumption. And by boundaries, you can look at it in terms of your two limits are, you can say, well, maybe I can separate them, but you know what, I'm assuming that the mortality will be the same for the impaired people. Might sound counterintuitive, obviously, but the reality is it is a boundary. If you assume that everybody in the impaired group has the same mortality as the healthy groups, then you're looking at a product you're going to start to pay much earlier. And that's going to be, by default, your more expensive option, because you're going to be paying them much earlier than they would normally have collected a death benefit. So by looking at that, that is your, I'll call it your worst case scenario, but it is a boundary. At the opposite end, you can say, you know what, I think anybody that meets that chronic illness definition is on their deathbed. And you're assuming a very, very high mortality on them. Well, if that's the case, then you're basically saying that they would have died very shortly after they were diagnosed or met the definition. So as a result of that, you're thinking this product is not going to have much of a difference. And the reason I expose that is there's judgment that goes into selecting your assumption. It is based on different things. Your assumption on what definition you're going to use. So if you think in the first example that everybody in the impaired group has the same mortality as everybody else, you obviously are thinking your definition is quite loose. You're just going to give the benefit to everybody who applies. And that means that obviously the mortality of that group is going to be lower on average, and more people are going to qualify. At the opposite end, as you restrict the number of people who can qualify, then you're basically saying my definition is really, really, really strict, and as a result, only the very sick will qualify. So by using these two, you can get to an answer. But because of the lack of mortality research on impaired lives, you're left with trying to guesstimate where that lies. Mortality improvement, as I mentioned, once you start to separate these groups, you need to consider what your mortality assumption will be, mortality improvement assumption will be. I could not find a lot of information on this over the years. I'm not sure if any of you will have suggestions for me after the session. The closest thing I could come up with, and it's not a good source, I find is the WHO. In terms of, it's not a good source for use, I would say. WHO does provide something called a healthy adjusted life expectancy, or HALE. It basically looks at your normal life expectancy and then deducts years for anything that is chronic. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. For anything that's chronic, they will reduce the life expectancy because of that. So as a result of that, you end up with two factors, the normal life expectancy as well as the health-adjusted life expectancy. And here what I'm showing is at birth and at age 60. At the top, I just took for a few countries the difference in life expectancy over a 16-year period. At the bottom, I converted it to an annual rate. I wouldn't draw too large conclusions out of this, but basically what I highlighted in yellow, it basically says that for a healthy life expectancy, over a 16-year period in the US, the WHO evaluated that it increased by 1.1 versus 1.6 in total. It gives you a hint that there might be some mortality improvement coming from the impaired lives, which you can reason. You can say that obviously new medication, new medical treatments, diabetes drugs, cardiovascular disease drugs, all these things help people to live longer. Other consideration you may have as you try to evaluate this, you can push the limits. You can certainly split up all your groups by different risk class. You can look at medical conditions because, as we'll see in a minute, the mortality rate for people who are diagnosed with cancer versus dementia are vastly different. So you can certainly start to cater your pricing or valuation to different medical diagnoses. You can look at income and education level, preferred classes, and just the standard age, sex, etc. And the reason I wanted to bring up the variation in mortality, here I'm showing a female age 75 at the time the person met the 2 out of 6 ADL or cognitive impairment. This is again from the SOA long-term care termination study. And I picked the 6 more common conditions. And as you can see from it, the cancer is the top line that you see, the red line. The mortality rate on cancer is much higher than the rest of the group. I flipped the slide, the graph to show you survival, so you can get an appreciation that the cancer mortality is, the survival rate is much weaker than if you look at conditions that are dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or anything that is could have a long-term aspect. So when you start to look at the payment, paying earlier than the mortality, the normal mortality of an individual, it will vary quite a bit by medical condition. And just to finish off, this is for males, so it's even more pronounced for cancer. But as you can see, the numbers at the bottom are months since the incurral. You can see that cancer, within a year, there's very few people left. But if you look at Alzheimer's disease or dementia, it stretches out over 10 or 12 years. And that's one of the difficulties even in pricing long-term care to begin with. We see usually a higher incidence of medical conditions like cancer, but the survival rate is very short. You have to think of when someone has cancer is unable to perform 2 out of 6 ADL, they're in pretty bad shape. But when you look at dementia and Alzheimer's disease, it's the inability to be left on your own, so you need to be supervised. So the onset could actually be earlier than the time of death. So with all these details in your head, hopefully that will help you to understand the modeling that was done specifically on the accelerated death benefit for chronic illness. And with that, I will pass it over to Jonathan.
Okay, thank you, Ben. I'd like to maybe just reverse that and say, hopefully with the modeling, I can explain all those details and solidify that in your head. Okay, I've termed it modeling mortality in the presence of morbidity. What we've done is 2 examples of models that one can build to try and understand this dynamic situation where you're essentially having a mortality risk in the presence of morbidity, so you essentially choose not to ignore the aspects of morbidity. The first example I'm going to demonstrate will require us to just revisit some of the actuarial maths, and but in a very superficial way, in essence. The example is going to ultimately use continuous time multi-state modeling to show how you might price a benefit and understand essentially this situation of mortality, morbidity interaction. Also, just to be clear, when I get deeper into the example, it's a benefit that's essentially paid over 2 years. It's an accelerated death benefit, and we've assumed it's on a chronic condition. However, we do use data from a long-term care portfolio just as that was available to us. Key to that, when we do this type of modeling, this continuous time modeling, we need data at the level of an individual. So we need quite rich informative data. Essentially, the long-term care data we have is at that level. The second example I'll take you through uses kind of more traditional actuarial projection methods, and it doesn't necessarily require that, and we'll use a set of industry standard tables and some judgment to essentially try to pull together the dynamic relationship between mortality and morbidity. All right, so just moving on quickly. Essentially, the blue line shown here is what we term the force of mortality. You can also come up with, I suppose, an incidence rate for morbidity and characterize it with a hazard rate and a curve ultimately. What's important is you can then characterize the survival rate using that force of mortality, morbidity, or lapse, or whatever it is in your multi-state model. And again, you can combine the force of mortality with the probability of survival to essentially get a curve of, if you're interested in mortality, time to death, or time to the event in terms of other decrements. Probably the last slide with kind of a lot of maths on it, so hopefully not to lose everybody, but just to remind us, and for the non-actuaries in the room, essentially we start with a survival function, which is a function of time, so it's essentially how long will you survive in a particular state. We can basically define that in terms of a starting age X, and then T is the survival time. What's important about this characterization is that essentially that survival function is just the exponentiate of the negative integrated hazard over the time. So it's essentially just saying the time you spend in that state, there's essentially a force that's pulling you towards the decrement. And it's quite a neat characterization. And again, if you have information or data at the level of an individual, you can model this quite neatly, as we'll come to see. Just to reiterate, it's not only the force of mortality, but you could, for example, look at incidence of morbidity or lapse rates, or even recovery rates in kind of more complex multi-state modeling. Another important point is that once you decide on the form of your model, you can use maximum likelihood estimation to derive parameters given a set of appropriate data. So you can, again, kind of understand some of the key features of the estimates you have and kind of look at the range of outcomes you get from your selected model. Also useful, you don't always have to work in continuous time. You can also use this continuous time model or modeling to essentially derive simple probability of survival for a single year or basic standard life tables in essence. And then just the last bit of information here is essentially just reiterating that essentially your hazard can be defined in terms of a parameter set, in this case theta, and how you would then solve for that theta is to use this detailed life level data, essentially producting out the probability of survival multiplied for those individuals who you do observe the death event, and then essentially just optimizing that with respect to the parameters. All right, so having said all that, just to move into the example, we've used a long-term care portfolio, just very high-level view of what that consisted of. It's over 15 years of experience data at the level of an individual, obviously. We've got several thousand exposure years in there and several thousand observed deaths, so we see this as providing reasonable credibility to support the modeling. Okay, so I suppose the first thing we need to do is understand mortality. So what we do is pretty standard. We estimate the crude mortality rate, essentially taking the total number of deaths observed within the population and dividing through by the central exposed. We do this for each age X and essentially produce the set of orange dots that you see there. What we find is putting it on a log scale, we get a reasonably linear curve in age, so nothing surprising about all of this. We're just saying that typically there's a log linear hazard of mortality across age, which is good. We're largely familiar and would expect that. The next step would then be to say, well, now if we consider morbidity, so in essence, if we were to take that population, separate the healthy from the impaired lives, and then recalculate the crude hazard rates, what would we expect to see? Well, we were hoping or expecting to see, in our case at least, this raised mortality of the impaired lives, so essentially saying once you've suffered some kind of health event and impairment, your mortality does increase. What was possibly more surprising is essentially the extent to which the increase was occurring in some of the younger ages, and how reasonably flat that new trend of mortality became once you had suffered impairment. As Ben had touched on, essentially what ends up happening is for the healthier lives, you're essentially getting effectively a reduction in the mortality rate, and that's obviously because it's derived from the orange line, which is then a weighted average of the two. So now to fit the first model, the emphasis of fitting 3 models, I suppose, is to show that there's a level of actuarial judgment required, especially when you don't have a good working model, or there hasn't been sufficient research to inform the best model in all instances. So I think that's obviously an ongoing endeavor to have the research and have the information to make informed model selections. So naively, I've gone and fitted a single curve. Just the form of the model, we're essentially saying that the log of the crude mortality rates is essentially a linear function in age with an offset and essentially a gradient for age. We fitted a single model here to the total population, so whether or not you're healthy or impaired, single line. That orange line would pass quite nicely essentially through the middle of the orange cloud, but it completely misses the impaired mortality. So from that aspect, it's a poor fitting model. And in terms of the healthy lives, certainly in the older ages, we can see it's essentially overestimating the mortality. Not to fear, without too much effort, we add a single parameter, and we can get a significant improvement in the qualitative fit of the model. We also got an improvement in some of the quantitative measures, not shown here, but I trust you would believe me. All we had to do was add a single parameter. What the parameter represents is essentially an offset. So you could think of this as a percentage loading onto the standard table. So we're just saying that the impaired are 500%, for example, of the healthy lives mortality, but essentially still parallel. And again, we kind of miss the data in the younger ages for the impaired lives. Again, we can add just a single parameter, this time allowing for the slope of the impaired lives mortality to change with age at a different rate to that of the healthy lives. And we essentially arrive to the model that is suitable for our purpose. I'll term this our best fitting model. And we'll use this as a reference point as we go through the discussion for part of the next part of the worked case study. Just before I get into the multi-state modeling and just some of the results we got when we actually attempted to price the accelerated death benefit, just reiterate that we've essentially fitted very similar models for lapse and the incidence of morbidity as well. So I'm just displaying here essentially the model that we selected for the incidence of morbidity. In this instance, we just have a separation on males and females, and we again see a very much a log linear kind of pattern with age in terms of as you get older, you're more likely to have a health event. I suppose an interesting feature, and one that was shown to be statistically significant within this experience data, is that in the younger ages, the females tend to have higher incidence of morbidity. I think just to remember, this is a long-term care portfolio we're modeling, so what that means is requiring care. One hypothesis, and I really hope it's not the case, and my wife would agree with me, is that the men are not as able to take care of their female partners, and in essence, that's why you're seeing this elevation in the younger ages for the females, requiring care sooner, typically, than their male partners. So just to show the situation in terms of the multi-state model that we've used, we're essentially every life is underwritten, as Ben had pointed out, when they buy the product, so they all start in the healthy state, and then through a force of incidence of morbidity, they'll find themselves moving potentially into an impaired state. From the impaired state, there'll be a force of mortality unique to those lives in the impaired state, taking them towards death. And then similarly, healthy lives could go into death without going through the impaired state, and of course we've modeled lapse, assuming lapse only occurs from the active state because of the nature of the benefit. Once you kind of accelerate the benefit by becoming impaired, there's little incentive to lapse. Just, again, just to make it clear the nature of the benefit we are modeling. So it's an accelerated death benefit. We're using the time of your first long-term care claim to essentially indicate when you became impaired. So it is a proxy, and I would caution against using the exact numbers here to price any product. Not that I think any of you would. Further to that, it is a dollar for dollar benefit. We've assumed that what would happen is they would pay that benefit out over a 2-year period. So essentially what happens is if you're able to stay in the impaired state for 2 years, you'll essentially exhaust that benefit and accelerate that benefit that you would have otherwise received on death. As I've shown, we've essentially derived incidence for morbidity. We've looked at mortality for healthy and impaired lives. We've derived a lapse assumption, and it's all based on that portfolio of long-term care lives that I've shown you, so roughly 10,000 lives. So just starting with the best model, which you might recall kind of looked like that for the mortality, having separate, very well-fitting models for the healthy and the impaired lives. What we then do is we essentially simulate the progression of that portfolio through the different states, obviously towards death and lapse, the 2 absorbing states. And on each simulation run, we're able to then calculate essentially the cost that would result in for an insurer in that particular reality. And then we can get a distribution of the range of relative costs of the benefit. Just to reiterate, the relative cost is essentially saying if it was a death-only benefit, how much would the insurer pay out on this portfolio, versus if you had that accelerated component with the rider, how much more would the insurer end up paying out in the product. So the figure in the top here, we're essentially seeing that there's quite a sharp peak around 7.5%. So it's essentially saying there's a relative cost of 7.5 for that type of benefit. What's very useful under this continuous time multi-state approach is that through the simulations, you actually get a sense of the range of statistical or process risk inherent in the model that you're modeling. So you're not just getting a single number, but you're kind of getting potentially confidence bounds around, well, if I want to be 95% certain that I don't underprice or overprice, where should I go? More than that, you have to remember that we've used a limited data set, a limited sample of data to estimate parameters, and there's a risk that that sample wasn't representative, and those parameters themselves can only yield so much of the truth. So if we go one step further and we essentially incorporate the process and misestimation risk into our simulations, we get a much flatter distribution with a wider range of possible relative costs, but once again, essentially for free under this kind of continuous time paradigm. The only reason it's not really for free is because you do need detailed data at the level of the individual, and I suppose, again, it's just a call to say the sooner that data is available and there's reliable sources for that, the sooner more of this type of work can be done. Just to reiterate, what I'm doing now is I'm kind of regressing to the worst models, so starting at the best model and now moving backwards and just saying, well, maybe you didn't know that you could fit a model that wasn't simply a percentage adjustment. So in other words, this model here, which I call the intermediate model, what we're doing is we're assuming that the impaired mortality is a loading on the healthy mortality. Seems like a reasonable assumption, but as we can see from this experience data, it doesn't fit the data terribly well. What is the consequence when you try and price a benefit? Some of the results are very similar to what we saw. So on the process risk only, you get quite a relatively tight distribution. The absolute price obviously has come in different and slightly lower in this instance, but depending on the portfolio and the nature of the portfolio and the benefit, it could be higher, could be lower. You don't really know. What we do know is a more consistent model or a better fitting model would give you more consistent, more accurate pricing on average. So we get a sense that you're getting a different price, but if you've chosen a bad model, you don't know is that price too high or too low, essentially. And again, you can incorporate misestimation risk, and you can get a range for the relative cost of the benefit that you're modeling. Finally, we can regress one step further and go to what I'm calling the inadequate model, where you essentially assumed a single force of mortality for both healthy and impaired lives, completely misses your data. And this is, I suppose, the scary part. You're again able to get a price. This time, however, the price is essentially double, in the range of double the price that you got on the more accurate model. And that's essentially the risk that you're exposed to in terms of modeling risk. So if you're unaware of what a good model or what a better model form would be, you're kind of, as an actuary, you're making a judgment call, but in a bit of a vacuum, and there is quite a lot of risk involved. Just to essentially summarize and kind of put those pictures all in one, what we're saying is that the better fitting model gives you a more accurate price, so that's the dark blue model. This is including the misestimation risk, so I suppose this is the full picture. And obviously, if you choose a model that's maybe inadequate, you can get quite a wide range on that and potentially over or under, and you don't really know which way it's going to go. So it's quite important that you have data and research to really support an appropriate model selection. So a related topic, and just to round out this continuous time example before I move to the kind of standard, more traditional actuarial projection type of a model, there might be a question in the minds of the audience as to, what is the relationship between mortality and morbidity, and, how do you maintain a consistent basis? So just a result from this sample of data again. What we can do is because we have the life level data, we can change the definition of impairment. So what I've done here is I'm using two different definitions. One is to say that you're impaired from the time of your first long-term care claim, regardless of whether that's requiring home care or facility care. And then I can use a more stringent definition of impairment to say it's from the time that you first required facility care. That we will recognize you as, say, an impaired life. What we then do is we get those morbidity incidence curves under the two scenarios. So I would call it the strict definition of facility-only claims versus the looser definition of all claims. And we take the ratio, so we're taking the facility-only, so we're taking the stricter definition dividing by the looser definition. And what do we find, for example, across all ages, we're finding that incidence comes down. So we're finding for age 60, you're kind of getting a 90% incidence on the more strict claim definition. Seems reasonably logical, nothing unusual about that. In terms of the mortality, though, the picture is a little bit mixed, so to speak. So what you're finding with the dashed lines is that the healthy mortality is now being modeled as being higher for the group when you use a stricter definition of morbidity for all ages above 60, whereas the impaired mortality is actually lower up until age 80. So you start to get this mixed effect, and it can be quite challenging to guess what that would be, what it should be, and as we've seen, kind of you're then getting exposed to essentially a model risk if you're unaware of what the best practice or what a realistic practice should be. Just to round out that example, what I then show here is that if you go and use the two definitions, the kind of strict and the less strict definition for impairment, you can again model the price of this particular benefit, and you again find that, maybe to answer Ben's question, that in fact what we're seeing here, at least on this product, is the price of the rider is essentially more sensitive to incidence than it is to that kind of mixed mortality effect. So by having a lower incidence on a tighter claim definition, we essentially end up with a slightly lower price. Okay, moving on to the second example. Same product that we're essentially modeling, but again, you needed an assumption basis. This time around, we were essentially saying, well, let's use what's available in terms of industry data and see if we can put that together in a framework that will give us a consistent relationship or result, allowing for kind of a dynamic interaction between mortality and morbidity. So just to highlight, we essentially used the SOA 2015 long-term care study for the incidence of morbidity. We used the Unismoke VBT 2015 as a standard basis of mortality. We set the impaired mortality as a loading of the standard basis, and then we back solve, if you will, for the mortality of the healthy lives to try and maintain essentially the standard basis for all lives. The model works fine, and it does capture the dynamic relationship between mortality and morbidity, but it is limited, and because there's no guarantee that what you're doing by combining these inconsistent bases is going to give you a consistent result. There are instances where the model does as best it can, but you can see the model break down. Maybe to elaborate, if you try and make your loading for impaired mortality too high at a particular age, you're killing more people in the impaired population than would die on a standard basis. So there's none left to die in the healthy state. So I suppose it's a risk, again, if the data and the research don't exist and you're just combining kind of ad hoc bases, you are exposing yourself to these type of inconsistencies, even if your model dynamic attempts to allow for it. We do have lapses in the model again, and it's the same portfolio of lives. So there's some comparability in the results, but I don't think that's not really the intention of the section. It's just to show how under this framework you can then vary your assumptions and you can get different prices again. So here we're just highlighting if you only vary the impaired mortality, so starting with a loading of none, so essentially assuming the same mortality for impaired to the standard lives, you'll come up with a relatively high price for the rider. And then if you kind of increase the benefit to the impaired lives by assuming that, if you increase the mortality for the impaired lives, you essentially decrease the cost of the benefit. And the reason for that is those impaired lives are now going to die on average sooner, so there's going to be less acceleration of their benefit. So that's effectively the result that we're seeing here. So you can get this using a traditional actuarial approach of sorts in Excel if you choose. You can go one step further and you can try and move both the mortality and the morbidity, and as you can see from the table here, you can then get a range of answers. So I've essentially done the same thing with the scenarios on the impaired mortality loadings, but then in terms of incidence, I've gone with 90% of the basis that we were using and 80% of the basis. Key take home from this slide, for me at least, is that in essence, if you change the two parameters together, you sometimes get results that show the interaction even in the simplistic model. So for example, a 20% reduction in morbidity incidence can lead to a 32% reduction in the cost of the benefit. So they can be kind of amplifications and interaction. And then just a final point on all of this from me. As Ben mentioned, there's another dimension to this which we weren't able to estimate with the single portfolio of data. We could, not reliably at least, we couldn't find a trend or separate trends in mortality for healthy and impaired lives. So again, just making the case for more research to inform the possibility that the trends are divergent or otherwise. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jonathan, and thanks, Ben. I'd like to open the floor to questions. Is there anybody who'd like to poke holes in what they've told us? Well, if you don't, I do. Sorry. The most remarkable result that Jonathan showed was that by increasing the incidence rates for the presumed long-term care, onset of long-term care that accelerates the benefit, for some ages you're actually lowering the mortality, and that of that particular group. And that's what we found in the data. That wasn't an assumption, and that actually caused some difficulties for us in making the model tie together. And that unintuitive result is one that actually, to me, is a warning that even though as an actuary we have a pretty good idea of how the model should work and what should be going on, like you lower the incidence rates, you increase the mortality rates. That's not always correct. And Ben actually showed some of the reasons why that may not be the case, right? So my question to Ben is: would you agree that the different LTC definitions might be the cause for that unintuitive result?
Is this working? Yeah. I think the main aspect is the conditions that I was mentioning, how the mortality differs by medical condition. As we start to isolate a definition, a stricter one, inadvertently we started to see that the portfolio of claims was moving more towards the mental dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or Parkinson's, which tend to have a longer lifespan. As a result of that, those are the reasons why we felt that this was coming up. And again, it comes back to the key question: is that group of mortality, of morbidity, that cohort, is not homogeneous. It's going to be a lot of variety based on what type of claims that you get and how these claims are assessed.
Okay, yeah, Faye?
Hello, Faye, Albert. I just wanted to ask what you're assuming is going to be the issues. How many of your issues, the life insurance issues that have these benefits attached to them, how many of them are going to be substandard?
So you're asking, so the policies that are issued with this rider, how many of them will be substandard lives? Right. I don't think it's any different. So obviously if this rider is available on life insurance, like life insurance in general, the majority of them will have standard or preferred. But they will be, as people age, the underwriting becomes stricter because of that rider. So they do adjust the underwriting based on age, and they start to look at chronic conditions and all these things, so to be able to isolate. So I don't think it's going to affect that much.
Okay, so in usual case, issues are like maybe 80% standard and 20% substandard.
That would be the expectation, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I'd probably want to disagree because I think your question is very relevant because the availability of this additional rider is definitely more attractive to people who have had some kind of health issue before, right? And so it just highlights that there are possibly things going on underneath the covers that we may not be able to capture with our model, and we have to be careful about what the impact of those might be. Yeah.
Yeah. But you have to think it's long-term care is sold to an older population usually. Average age in the 60s, while this rider is sold on life insurance, so your average age ends up being lower. So for that reason, I can see that argument at older ages, but for a general population, it wouldn't be I don't think it's going to materialize the same way.
I see that there are a couple of demographers in the room, so I have a question to the floor instead of the panel. So we were obviously trying to understand healthy and disabled mortality or healthy and disabled life expectancy better, and essentially my question is: do you see any opportunity for our two disciplines to work more closely together to generate better insights from the publicly available data on healthy and disabled life expectancy? So, yes, I see someone. Yes.
Yes, sorry. I think so. I don't know whether you know, but I'm coordinating the International Network on Disability-Free Life Expectancy. And maybe some of the figures you are presenting from the World Health Organization are not really trustable. We know that there is no mortality data for many, many countries. So we can imagine for how many countries we have morbidity and disability data. So during the last 20, 30 years, mainly the United States and Canada and the North America, the Western European countries and Japan made a huge effort to collect public data on disability. And we had comparable estimates of disability-free life expectancy between the United States from the 60s or the 70s to very recently, to 2010. We had estimates of also disability-free life expectancy with similar, very comparable indicator for Japan since the beginning of the 90s. And from the European countries, the one belonging to the European Union, from 2004. But this new series, very long in the US, about 10 years, 20 years in Japan, and about a little bit more than 10 years in Europe, were very comparable until, let's say, 2014. But unhappily, in the United States, the National Center on Health Statistics decided to stop collecting on data on the same variables about disability in the daily life, limitation in usual activities, and this is really breaking the longest series we had on disability-free life expectancy. And after Eurostat has made a huge effort between 2004 and 2014 to strongly standardize and harmonize the way to collect the data in the 28 European countries. So since 2014, Eurostat thought the work is done. Now the data collection is really comparable between all the European countries, but in fact it's not true, because now the countries are becoming to their main interest. And for example, a good example is Germany. Germany was really unhappy because with this common indicator, they were badly ranked. So they decided to change the indicator, like that they are higher in the list. And Sweden did the same, and the Netherlands did something very similar. So we are, during the last year, losing something. It took years and years for us to establish this new indicator, computing disability-free life expectancy in the most advanced countries with a very comparable indicator. So yes, we can work together, and I think it's really important if the insurance companies are really making the administration knowing that they are really interested having a stable indicator of morbidity or a stable indicator of disability over time. And that it's totally stupid to interrupt a chronological series already available.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie. Did you have a... Okay.
What I can say specifically is that in the U.S. federal government, I think at least the Census Bureau would love to do something like that. There is a pressure in government agencies to, instead of conducting new surveys or adding new questions to our surveys, to use existing administrative and industry data. So the potential for cooperation is definitely there. I mean, there are Census Bureau surveys that this would fit into. In my own work, part of my task is to deal with housing for the disabled. And that does get into long-term care and the relationships between morbidity and mortality.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ward. Those are ideas or directions that we definitely should consider for collaboration, and maybe we can put it on the agenda for Living to 100 2023 when we come together again and speak about our achievements in this area. Well, are there any further questions from the floor? Famous last words? No? Well then, thank you very much for attending. It was a pleasure to have you, and I'll close the session today. Thank you.